All right, Alexander. Boris Johnson, he was going to be prime minister. Actually, he said he had enough votes. I think he said he had 102. But he said, I have enough votes. I could be prime minister tomorrow, but I don't want the job. He was saying that he pretty much couldn't govern. That was what he was hinting at. It would be hard to govern. There's just not enough consensus. And he's out. He was in, and now he's out. And it looks like all signs are now pointing to who we originally said was going to be prime minister way back when you made the prediction about the events. It looks like we've circled back, taking a quote from Jen Psaki, we've circled back around to Rishi Sunak. Now, real quick, my theory on Johnson is he definitely would love to be prime minister. No doubt about it. I mean, he flew all the way back from holiday. I mean, to look at the possibility of becoming prime minister again. But my thinking there is that he understood that if I'm prime minister, number one, the situation is awful, and number two, I'm going to be out in 3, 4, 5, 6 months anyway, so it's just going to be an embarrassment. So you know what? It's best not to do it. I mean, he understood that it would be a very temporary prime minister position that he would be in. He understood that. He said, out.
You are absolutely right about that. Now, can I just say, and I just want to say this because, of course, we've been discussing this whole situation for a couple of weeks now. And if you remember, the governor of the Bank of England came out, made that statement, panicked the gilt markets. We said at the time, plot against Kwarteng to get him out of the chancellorship. And sure enough, a few days later, Kwarteng was gone. We said intention is to get Liz Truss out of Downing Street. Sure enough, Liz Truss is gone. And we said right from the beginning, and we have always consistently said that the people who are carrying out this plot, because plot it is, their intention is to get Rishi Sunak into Downing Street as British Prime Minister. And I think it is highly likely, almost certain, they're not absolutely certain. I mean, there's still Penny Mordaunt trying to put together some kind of leadership bid. But I think it is very, very likely indeed that we're going to have Rishi Sunak Prime Minister of Great Britain by the end of today, and that it will be done without any vote. In other words, Penny Mordaunt will drop her challenge, and he will just be crowned Prime Minister, which is what, of course, the plotters always intended. Now, about Boris Johnson, I think you've got it exactly correct. I think he thought that, he had a chance of coming back in. He was on holiday in the Caribbean when this crisis blew up, which, by the way, is a strong sign that he didn't know that this crisis was coming. So, his political antennae were not there. If he'd known that there was a crisis, he would have been in London to take advantage of it, but he wasn't. So he launched this leadership bid while he was in the Caribbean. He seemed to be getting a certain amount of support. He then came to London. He will have taken soundings. He will have very, very quickly realized that the forces behind Sunak are just too powerful, that if by any possible chance he were to become prime minister himself, that would mean that very quickly he would cease to be prime minister, and in circumstances that would be disastrous for him. So he tried, he threw the dice one last time. He arranged a meeting with Sunak. He went into this meeting with Sunak. He apparently said to Sunak, look, I've got 102 MPs backing me, enough to get on a ballot with the membership. The members are likely to vote for me. I'm likely to become prime minister. Why don't we do a deal? Why don't you drop your leadership bid and join me in a joint ticket, and I'll make you chancellor or something like that? And firstly, I'm not sure that he did have 102 MPs backing him. He's only got 57 announced behind him. Secondly, Sunak knows perfectly well that the forces that are wanting to make him prime minister are ultimately irresistible. So Sunak called Boris's bluff, said, no, I'm going to remain in the race. And after that, Boris knew that if he couldn't get Sunak round, I mean, it's the only chance he would have had to become prime minister was to get Sunak to agree, or rather, his only chance to form a functioning government was to get Sunak to agree and to join the government. And of course, when it became clear that Sunak was not going to do that, Boris had no option but to pull out. So we're going to get Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of Great Britain, as I said, unless Penny Mordaunt can pull off some kind of miracle, which I don't expect. I think that it's likely he'll be Prime Minister by the end of today.
Right. So we're filming this in the morning, London time, by the way. What time is it for you right now?
Well, it's actually 10. 5 minutes past 10 in the morning.
So we're filming this in the morning. So
exactly. But events will play out over the course of the day. I think, as I said, he will be crowned essentially prime minister, like Theresa May was. You remember when Cameron resigned, it was very similar. Same sort of people pulled all the strings, pulled all the levers. Theresa May became prime minister. You remember, her policy: keep Britain as close to the European Union as possible, keep it in the single market, come up with the softest imaginable Brexit. That was her policy. That was what her backers, our ultimate backers, wanted. They didn't want the membership to have a say. Boris Johnson, who would have been the challenger, was basically torpedoed before he could get there. And they've achieved the same thing. They've managed to knock out Johnson, knock out Truss, knock out Kwarteng, who was, if you also remember, I used to say Kwarteng was Sunak's potential rival. They've got their man. They're going to install him. There's not going to be any kind of election either within the Conservative Party or in the country. They got their man. He'll be in charge. His net worth is said to be £750 million with his wife. Very, very rich man. The richest man to become prime minister in modern times. Died in the wood globalist with massive financial connections, including in Russia, by the way. And he's not, in my opinion, going to continue Johnson's policy. He's going to reinstall the old establishment, the pre-2016 establishment to which he belongs and which has leveraged him into power.
Right. So 2 questions. Why would Sunak want to be prime minister? Okay, I understand ego and the desire for power, but he must also know that he's also just kind of a stopgap. He's just a prime minister on the path to what they really want, which is Keir Starmer. So he understands that he's just kind of, filling in the gaps until they get to Starmer. So then why would he want to be that person? That's the first question. The second question is, okay, he's a globalist. He's going to want to reintegrate, I imagine, the UK with the EU, even though he said he was a leave kind of guy. Obviously, he's going to want to push the UK into the arms of the European Union, and of course, more integration with the United States and the collective. That's fine. That's a given. I think you're going to get that from any candidate going forward, from any prime minister going forward. But his position on Russia is a bit unknown. There could be, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen. I don't think the position on Russia is going to change, but maybe a 1% chance that Sunak does deviate slightly from the escalation with regards to Russia and the endless amounts of money and weapons that the UK is sending to Ukraine. Maybe he starts to put a stop to that, because I think he did mention something along the lines of, the UK just doesn't have the money for this anymore. I'm not sure what the quote was, but he was hinting at the fact that, look, we don't have cash. We can't continue to just dole out money to the Zelensky regime and to anybody. we're broke. That was pretty much what he was saying. Anyway, what do you think of
Right.
those
The two very good questions. Let's start with the first one, which I don't actually have a straightforward answer to. I am not able to understand why any Conservative wants to become leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister at this time. I mean, the situation is terrible in Britain. There's no sign that anything that anybody can practically do within the incredibly tight limits that the establishment has set is going to change anything. On the contrary, it's probably going to go on getting worse. I say that because anticipating my answer to your second question, I don't believe that he's going to change the one policy that would make a difference, which is ending this conflict, the economic part of the conflict with Russia over Ukraine. So I can't really see why he personally would want to become prime minister at this time. There's just a few things I will say. Firstly, he's very young. I mean, he's 42. He's been 7 years an MP. Just 7 years. He's been in the cabinet for 2 of those years, which is, by the way, an extraordinary rise. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, became an MP in 1959. And it was 20 years before she became prime minister. And she was she worked her way up before she reached that point. I mean, Sunak has just shot up at a phenomenal speed. So it's possible, like people who rise very fast and very far, and who've got vast amounts of money behind them, that he's overconfident and that he says to himself, well, I'm a genius. Everybody tells me I'm a genius. By the way, I know somebody who knew him at school, Winchester. And even then, apparently, Sunak thought he was a genius. Just saying. I don't know Sunak myself. But, maybe he thinks he's a genius. Maybe he thinks he can pull it together. Maybe he thinks he's got this tremendous connection to the British public, which will pull everything together. He doesn't, by the way. I mean, he's very remote from them. There's a famous incident where he didn't know how to use a contactless card at a petrol station. So I mean, he functions in a world that most people just, so remote from them that he just doesn't. But perhaps he thinks he has all those skills. So there is one other possibility, however. I said he's a globalist. I said he's worth £750 million. I should say this is money that he has, the net worth, he and his wife together. His father-in-law is a massive international Indian businessman. It could very well be that ultimately the reason that Sunak is coming in is because he's got all of these massive interests. He's got all of these massive interests behind him, but he's involved in all of that himself. And he's coming in as prime minister to basically protect those interests, which are his interests, up to that time when, as I said, Starmer, who doesn't have great understanding of such things, is able to come in and take over. In other words, he's there to protect the interests of big globalist money during the transition period. So that could be what it's all about. I mean, I can't give you a more concrete, definite, certain explanation of all of that than that. So that's why I think he might want to be prime minister. Now, I'm afraid I've forgotten your second question, so if you could just quickly remind me.
No, I think you answered it. Russia,
Yeah.
you answered it.
Oh, Russia.
Will there be some sort of deviation with Russia and Ukraine?
No, I don't think there will be. There's 3 things to say about this. Firstly, Sunak has, through a hedge fund, had business interests in Russia. He probably has a little bit more knowledge of the country than the rest of the British political class. I mean, he probably knows it's not just a gas station. So he probably has that glimmer of, greater knowledge. Mind you, this particular hedge fund supposedly pulled out of Russia in April, but most people think it's still got some foot in the door in Russia. But so he probably has a little bit more knowledge of Russia. The second is, as I said, he's Indian. He's a practicing Hindu, by the way. His father-in-law is an Indian mega billionaire, vast wealth. Indians have a very different attitude towards Russia than the rest of, the British establishment does. So he probably doesn't share that visceral loathing of Russia that you see among so many establishment people in Britain. And he probably has a little bit more knowledge of Russia than the establishment does. But I can't imagine that Sunak is going to put his entire political position at the moment, at risk by going against the orthodoxy, the British establishment orthodoxy on Russia. Maybe if over the next few weeks he's able to carve out some political space, he might try to get some kind of dialogue with the Russians going again. But he strikes me as too cautious a man to just rush into that. And I don't think he's going to change policy myself in any fundamental way.
Yeah, but then that means that there's no way out for the crisis in the UK. I mean,
no.
If he wants to fix the economic problems, the first step, it doesn't fix everything, but the first step is to start to pause this sanctions hysteria, and then to try and roll it back. That's the first step. That's number one. So if you don't even want to take that first step, it means that you can't get to a position where you're actually starting to change the terrible trajectory of the UK economy. So he's stuck.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Now, of course, I come back to my answer to your first question. If his reason for becoming prime minister at this time is to protect the interests of big globalist money, given that he's a globalist himself, maybe he's not too bothered about that. I mean, he'll say, I'll be prime minister for 2 years, which is very nice. I'll have Downing Street, I'll have Chequers, these stately homes to go to. I'll be able to meet King Charles. I'll have all that. Maybe that's, that's my thing. But ultimately, I'm looking after my own interests and those of my class, if you like. And that's really what I'm about. Of course, if he does have bigger ambitions, you're absolutely correct. There's lots. Britain has a massive accumulation of problems going back a long way. But you can't turn things round unless you end this war of attrition, this economic war of attrition with the Russians. And perhaps he understands that. Perhaps at some point, if he consolidates his position sufficiently in London, he will try and find a way out. But I have to say, I don't think so. By the way, I just wanted to add one other thing, because you mentioned at the start, at a certain point in our program, that Sunak supported Leave in the Brexit referendum, which he did, by the way. He actually campaigned for Leave. And by the way, did so against the then Prime Minister Cameron's advice. Cameron told him this will be the end of your political career. Sunak probably said to himself, what do I care? I'm enormously rich. I don't have to worry too much. I can afford to take risks. And Sunak probably did that because he wanted to rise, a bit like Boris Johnson. He knew that there was this current of opinion within the Conservative Party that would propel him upwards. If he took a Leave position, it might not be looked upon very favorably by people like Cameron. But I think that was what it was all about. Since the Brexit referendum, he has associated himself with all sorts of people who are staunch Remainers. I mean, and during the Brexit war, he repeatedly supported Theresa May's soft Brexit position. So, you can't talk here about a really deeply committed Brexiter. I just wanted to clear this up.
Right. Okay. Any other final thoughts before we wrap this one up?
Well, I'm going to say this. I remain very unhappy about this whole business. I'm not going to say very much about my feelings about Boris Johnson. I am so angry with Boris Johnson and how he squandered the opportunity that he was given. That I don't want to talk too strongly about this, but I certainly wouldn't want him prime minister again. My opinion of Liz Truss, again, I think everybody who follows our program knows that I think she was completely unqualified to become prime minister of Britain. Kwarteng is a clever man, not as clever as he thinks, in my opinion, and I don't think he was remotely up to the job of being chancellor at this time either. But none of that takes away the fact that in Britain, supposedly a constitutional monarchy which operates as a democracy where the people elect their government, none of this changes the fact that power has changed as a result of a conspiracy. And I don't like conspiracies. I don't think this is something that I want to see in my country. I think that, well, exactly. I mean, it is a very, very bad thing. I may not like Johnson. I may not think very much of Liz Truss. I may think that Kwarteng was the wrong man at the wrong time. But the whole thing, for me, leaves a very disturbing feeling. And again, I'm choosing my words very, very carefully. We've seen a plot. We've seen a prime minister who's about to be installed, who is the diametric opposite in terms of his political philosophy to what the British people thought they were voting for in 2019 at the time of the last election. And we've seen the Brexit referendum, to all intents and purposes, cancelled in all but name. And it's all been done not through the British people deciding we made a mistake in 2016, we made a mistake in 2019, we've got to change course, which is their right. It's been done by a cabal of plotters installed in various parts of the British establishment who've never accepted the outcome of the 2016 referendum and who have worked against it incessantly and who have now won.
Yep. They've rolled everything back. All right. Even to a worse position, to be honest.
Absolutely.
All right. TheDuran.locals.com. We are now on Rockfin as well. And the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.